Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, I'm extremely honored to address this wonderful conference, and I thank my friends in the Sustainable Development Policy Institute in Pakistan for inviting me. The theme of this meeting or conference, titled The Future of the Belt and Road Initiative in the Post-COVID World, is the most appropriate and timely one. Large parts of the world are still reeling from the impact of this pandemic, and the world economy, outside of China, of course, and some of its partners and neighbors, is still in a state of shock. Hopefully, with the advancement of the research, production, and application of the many vaccines we have today, some of that effect can be mitigated. But be forewarned, we will and should not go back to the previous economic and financial practices in the transatlantic area, especially. And I will explain why. We should instead learn from the way China dealt not only with the COVID 19 crisis, but most emphatically with previous crises like the 2008 global financial crisis, which is the case study of my presentation. Failing to learn from the lessons of past crises will doom the world to repeating the same mistakes that make us vulnerable or made us vulnerable to the coronavirus. Leaders in the US and Europe are waiting for the time when things can go back to normal, as they say. But there is really no normal to go back to because the Western financial and banking systems were already heading into a new phase of collapse even before the COVID 19 outbreak. Besides, hunger, poverty, and lack of basic services like healthcare and other infrastructure were rampant across large parts of the globe before the COVID 19 pandemic. So that's really not a pleasant normal to go back to. In response to the 2008 financial crisis, the big four central banks of the United States, the European Union, Britain, and Japan created or printed rather between 13 and 14 trillion dollars from 2008 to 2018 by the so-called quantitative easing programs. And they have issued also temporary liquidity loans to banks in the many trillions of dollars in addition. But none of that money has been created for an economic purpose, nor for a trade purpose. It has all been created for a strictly financial purpose. That is providing the largest banks in the West with enough capital and liquid reserves to survive massive losses and bad debt. Even under the corona pandemic, there are still today no signs that the failed quantitative easing is going to be abandoned. When the corona pandemic struck the global economy in early March, the financial markets were already ripe for a collapse, and historic crashes of the stock markets were recorded. The usual knee-jerk response by the US and European central banks was to open the floodgates of money again. Coming on top of the quantitative easing practiced by the Western central banks, reaching $20 trillion in printed money from 2008 to 2020, additional $5 trillion were printed in 2020 alone. Once again, none of that money is used for real physical economic purposes. And the shocking factor is that money is being created and dispersed to financial markets and banks at incredible ease and swiftness, with the decision made by the central bankers bypassing the elected parliaments and governments. In contrast, allocating financial resources to real economic projects take months and sometimes even years of discussions. Now, we come to the way China dealt with the crisis in 2008, which illustrates the difference between what we call credit systems and monetary debt systems. According to the late American economist Lyndon LaRouche, true economic value lies not in money or in natural resources, but rather in the creative, productive powers of labor, and in increasing this power through scientific and technological advancement. All policies in society, including the issuance of money and credit, should be directed to improving the productive powers of labor, which includes financing and building platforms of basic economic infrastructure, that is, transport, power generation, water management, healthcare, and education, including science driver programs such as nuclear technology and space exploration programs. President Xi Jinping has expressed a clear understanding of this concept, and he frequently reminds his Communist Party comrades of the importance of this principle in defining China's development strategy. In a speech he delivered at a 2014 seminar commemorating Deng Xiaoping, President Xi said, quote, "The chief criterion he," that's Deng Xiaoping, "put forward for judging any action is whether it promotes the growth of the productive forces in a socialist society, increases the overall strength of the socialist state, and raises the living standards." So that's the criterion. So the correlation between the development of advanced infrastructure and the increase in the productivity of the economy is thoroughly proven from studies conducted even on the US economy itself, especially in the period of President Franklin Roosevelt's administration and the period of President John F. Kennedy's administration. China's reaction to the 2008 crisis was shaped by this intention, not to simply save the markets. The big four public commercial banks of China, Export-Import Bank, China Construction Bank, China Development Bank, and China National Agricultural Bank, issued nearly as much new currency or money in the form of loans as have the US, EU, the UK, and Japanese central banks in the same period between 2008 and 2018. So China also issued, or the Chinese banks also issued, a similar amount of so-called money in the form of credit. However, the lending of the Chinese banks has fostered extraordinary new platforms of transportation, navigation, water management, power production, agricultural production, and scientific research in the Chinese economy. This process enabled China to reach the goal of lifting hundreds of millions of Chinese citizens out of poverty. And by last month, China lifted the remaining few millions of its citizens out of extreme poverty. Beyond China, these Chinese banks have also extended roughly $300 billion since 2014 in additional credit for infrastructure projects outside China through the Belt and Road Initiative. So the correlation between the productive credit policy and high quality growth can be illustrated by one of the brightest examples. That is the sudden appearance in one decade of more high-speed rail mileage in China than the rest of the world combined. This has produced very high rates of multi-factor productivity growth and general economic growth and progress. According to a World Bank report published in 2019, China has made fantastic progress in developing its transport infrastructure. Since 2008, China has put into operation over 25,000 kilometers of dedicated high-speed rail lines, far more than the total high-speed lines operating in the rest of the world. Ironically, the first high-speed rail line was inaugurated right at the point when the financial collapse on Wall Street started to snowball. That was in early August 2008, when the first fully high-speed railway line in China was opened between Beijing and Tianjin. So here I come to the concluding part of my presentation, because China's policymaking with respect to its internal development carries over into its relationship with other nations through the Belt and Road Initiative. Given the economic impact of the corona lockdown in China and globally, we can imagine that this whole process will be further accelerated. That is to carry on the Chinese policy at home to the Belt and Road nations. What these policies of investment have achieved, besides recovering from the 2008 crisis, is that it made China the world champion in construction of most efficient infrastructure with the highest construction speed, efficiency, and low cost. This means that China's competitive edge has increased in the global construction market. Many nations in the world are hungry for this kind of rapid development. But unfortunately, the global financial and economic system has been ill-suited for it. The monetary system and credit system, the two which I illustrated, can no longer exist in the same universe to ensure sustained economic development for all nations. Therefore, a new global system of credit is badly needed for the global recovery from the COVID-19 pandemic. We cannot go back to the pre-pandemic normal because that normal implied a collapsing financial and banking system in addition to social and economic degeneration in the West, and it implies massive poverty in Africa, South America, and large parts of Asia. The weakened global physical economy was glaringly exposed by the coronavirus, which showed a world both in the advanced and developing sectors that was physically unprepared to tackle such a problem. So, in conclusion, my recommendations is that to deal with this pandemic and deal with the coming ones, the global health system has to be physically built from the ground up, starting with massive construction of infrastructure. In putting points, my first point is the making of the Belt and Road Initiative a global practice. This is how we can achieve both the global healthcare coverage, but also a growing world economy. Number one is making the Belt and Road Initiative a global practice with the industrial nations in the West and East participating in it for their own benefit and for that of their partners around the world, and that would be made possible. That's what the Chinese call the win-win. This should be based on the best practice of China in handling the 2008 and 2020 crises. Two, this will require a new financing mechanism on a global scale, some sort of a new Bretton Woods system among sovereign nations, equally sovereign nations. We need a new international credit mechanism to finance modern infrastructure along the lines of the BRI. Three, I have two warnings to issue here in conclusion, although they could be the subject of a completely separate conference, but I have to mention them here in conclusion because I think they are important. A, there are attempts in the transatlantic region to impose so-called green and climate change criteria and restrictions on financing infrastructure. These will soon not only include coal power, which is already blacklisted, and other fossil fuels, but it will soon include even hydropower and nuclear power. This is, in my viewpoint, is a suicidal path that should not be followed. We should avoid that kind of policy. B, there are attempts to force China to open its financial markets to hot money coming mostly from the West rather than long-term investment. This should be resisted for the reasons I mentioned above. Finance and credit should be strictly connected to improving the productivity and living standards of nations by investing in infrastructure, for example, and scientific progress, not making quick profits. I thank you very much for your patience, and I wish you all a great and fruitful discussion, and I'll be available to any questions. Thank you very much.